Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fukowski, and today we're going to be talking about social policy making, and this will cover things like Medicare, Social Security, things that many Americans rely on on a daily basis. So, if you look at the original Constitution, people today would say, well, I don't find anywhere within the Constitution where it says that the government should be providing Medicare, should be providing health insurance, or providing Social Security. Well, really where that comes from, and of course this is taking a really big extension of it, is from the preamble, where especially the portion where it says to promote the general welfare. In that particular portion, that is where the justification comes. Whether or not you buy that, that is where the government has, for the most part, when it at least comes to social policy, has attempted to justify its role in those capacities. So, over time, as we know, especially starting with FDR, that the extent of the government's responsibility has definitely changed over time. Remember, it used to be a laissez-faire economy where the government had basically a very limited role, and that definitely changed following the Great Depression, and we've seen government continue to expand in its responsibility, most notably through the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. So social welfare programs undoubtedly are controversial. I mean, think about when we have class discussions, think about when we have just topics in the news. A lot of it comes down to social welfare, and it is a very controversial topic. Sorry about my washing machine in the background. But nevertheless, most Americans will, at one point in their life, be recipients of government welfare. And all that really entails is receiving any type of assistance from the government. Now, welfare includes anything technically from Social Security to Medicare. Those are two things that you would pay into to receive that benefit. That is technically considered government welfare because it's coming from the government, even though you are paying through it. But I think most of us tend to think of welfare as things like food stamps or Medicaid. But nevertheless, this is considered government welfare. So most Americans will wind up on government welfare, most of which at the age of 65, 66 with Social Security. But the number one program is, of course, Social Security that Americans depend on most. And, of course, this is your pension or insurance plan for the elderly, as well as the poor and disabled. So you can actually go on Social Security before you're even a retired, you're retired at the age of 65. If you're disabled or if you're very poor and you meet a certain threshold, you can also receive benefits that way. And in that case, you wouldn't really be paying into it necessarily. But the problem, of course, with Social Security is that it's running out of money, and it's projected to completely run out by approximately 2035. Now, there have been prior attempts, such as George W. Bush in 2005, 2006, to privatize it, but that was quashed pretty quickly. But still, not much has been done. Might they raise it to age 70? That's very possible, but that remains to be determined. Other welfare programs include Medicare, that of course is health care for the senior citizens, and we have Medicaid, and Medicaid provides health insurance for the very poor. You also have things like food stamps, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but those also would include welfare type programs. And then, as I just mentioned, I got ahead of myself, but in 2005, when Bush was trying to push for the privatization of Social Security because of the baby boomer generation, which is beginning to retire, and then again, this could be leading to bankruptcy. So it will be interesting to see what happens as a result of that. Now, the welfare programs that you typically think of are known as means test programs. So in contrast to entitlement programs, which you pay through employer taxes, these provide benefits to people with specific needs. Means basically that you have to meet some type of eligibility requirement, whether that be you can't make more than $10,000 a year, or you have to, be under this threshold with this many children. So means-tested programs are only available to specific people with specific needs. Most people are not on means-tested programs. So again, there are eligibility requirements as opposed to entitlement programs where you pay yourself. Means-tested programs such as Medicaid, you do not. Now, there are some, including TANF, which stands for the Temporary Assistance of Needy Families. That is better known as the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, which gives more of the responsibility on the states. There's also something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, in which the working poor receive a check from Washington instead of course, paying one. Again, you have to meet certain eligibility requirements, typically with income, maybe having a certain number of children or dependents. That's also embedded into that. But again, those are means-tested programs. Most people do not qualify, because if they did, then the government would be even in further amount of debt than it already is. Other things about health care. Congress has defeated health care in 1993. There was also a drive by Hillary Clinton. It was actually at the time, I don't know if they coined it as Hillary Care, but something along those lines. That also failed. But of course, the Affordable Care Act under President Obama has changed that, providing health insurance that people, again, are paying for. And if you don't get health insurance, come around tax season, you have to pay, I think as of now, it's about $1,000 penalty, which is a decent amount. And apparently those amounts are going to be increasing if you still don't get onto the health exchange. Other types of social policy, well, this includes the Food and Drug Administration, otherwise known as the FDA. And of course, the fact that when you look at food products, if you look at the labels like I do, from calories to what ingredients are in your food, that's important because that's all regulated by the FDA. It's also important with drugs in terms of pharmaceutical drugs. Make sure that things are studied on rats and monkeys and so on. And, to get a drug to go on the market that's going to be used by humans takes a considerable amount of time. And perhaps it's a good thing in some respects, because you want to make sure that the public is being protected before any drug that possibly could give you cancer, instead of curing it, is screened beforehand. And then you also have the CDC. You're probably familiar with that, the Center for Disease and Control for Prevention, I think. I don't know why it's not called CDCP, but nevertheless, this monitors diseases, specifically in North America. If you remember the whole Ebola scare, the CDC was very much involved in trying to contain that and pass more stringent policies on that as to how to deal with that in the future. Other social policy falls in the realm of public education. We know that this is an interesting case study in the sense that education is a reserved right, typically the responsibility of the states. And even if the states say this is a responsibility of local districts, and it is, because, for example, Vernon taxpayers pay taxes to Vernon schools, with, of course, some state assistance as well. But nevertheless, most of the social policy with schools resides in the states or the local districts. Now, where we've seen some federal intervention has been with what is known as the Head Start programs. And this was under the Great Society, which was spearheaded in the 1960s with President Johnson, trying to help underprivileged children in education, specifically targeting poorer kids, and it helps a lot of kids in the urban cities go to school, provides things like a snack, food, reduced lunch. And, most people would say, well, schools shouldn't provide you with lunch, but think about if you didn't eat, how difficult it would be for you to learn. So it's people who can't even afford to really feed their children a nutritious lunch, thanks to programs like Head Start, that takes sort of the role. Probably the more important aspect of the federal government taking a little bit of a role in public education deals with No Child Left Behind. And basically this was an unfunded mandate, sets higher standards, more testing, especially for teachers. And states that fail to meet these standards could lose a ton of federal funding. In some cases, it would direct the state to shut down schools, and that's actually happened. It's come under an enormous amount of fire. It is still very much in effect, but a lot of it has, to some extent, been repealed. But this is sort of a landmark piece of legislation, as it has more testing for schools nationwide at a higher level. And this actually has nothing to do with Park. That's a whole separate ball game. Nevertheless, the federal government funds less than 10% of money spent on education. Most of it is going to be done by the states and at the local level. As I said earlier, thanks to things like property taxes. And final two slides. So in terms of regulatory policy, this somewhat overlaps with our bureaucracy unit, but regulation really of businesses doesn't occur until the 1800s, late 1800s. And we've seen the amount of regulation definitely grow significantly as to what businesses can and cannot do. But really the big thing about this, and you know this from US too, is that it will eliminate things like monopolies. So think about Rockefeller. It regulates labor practices and antitrust activity to really make the economy more, I guess, fairer to participate in. If a company gets too big and there's not enough competition, you'll see that antitrust lawsuits will be filed on behalf of the citizens. In terms of labor and government, you have things like the National Labor Relations Board, which regulates labor management relations. So, for example, if unions and the employer can't, agree to a specific rate, and there's talks of strikes, sometimes you'll see them get involved. But historically, the government does side with business. Think businesses generate revenue, government benefits from that as a result of taxes. So that does make some sense there. Another important thing that we've mentioned in the past is the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, and this basically gives the unions the right of collective bargaining, but prohibited various unfair practices by unions. So, for example, when, let's say, the Vernon Teachers Association, the VTEA, Education Association, meets with the Board of Education to negotiate pay raises, they're advocating on behalf of everybody. That's collective bargaining, as opposed to me, myself, going in front of the Board of Education and trying to negotiate for a raise. They are acting on behalf of all the employees. Now, there are some practices outlawed by unions, such as strikes. For example, in New York City, teachers are not allowed to strike, or let's say police officers, because that would do undue harm to the public potentially. Nevertheless, government now provides unemployment compensation. If you look at your pay stub, if you have a job, you'll see that taxes are taken out for unemployment should you unfortunately lose your job. And of course, there is a minimum wage. That does, of course, vary by states. And last but not least, with environment, we have the Department of Energy, which was created in the 1970s as a result of the gas shortages when OPEC refused to provide oil to the United States for political reasons. And so it's set up to essentially make sure that there's enough energy available at a cheap enough price. And so that's definitely a good thing. But a lot of conservatives and Republicans dislike the Environmental Protection Agency, which we've briefly looked at under the bureaucracy unit, in which it enforces policies on water and air pollution. Every state essentially has an EPA. So if you were going to build something, it's very difficult because not only do you have to get building permits, but you also have to get basically clearance from either the state EPA or the national EPA to make sure that you're not building on a swamp or protected land, that you're not going to kill some important insect, that if that insect were to die, then the whole environment's going to collapse. So there's a lot of bureaucracy dealing just with the environment, and sometimes that can be really controversial. So ultimately, there have been two big pieces of legislation dealing with the environment. The first one, of course, being the Clean Air Act of 1970, that mandating that the Department of Transportation reduce automobile emissions. So it sets higher limits. That Barack Obama has actually increased the amount of miles per gallon that all new cars are going to now have to meet to reduce carbon emissions. Then you also have the Endangered Species Act of 1973, and it's talking about active protection by the government regardless of economic effects. A lot of businesses hate these pieces of legislation, although they do protect the environment. Some say that the EPA and these pieces of legislation are anti-business. So some controversy there. But policy is always controversial, and it's always being evaluated, as we said in our first or second slide when we looked at how policy is implemented, and it's always going to be evaluated. And some people want to repeal certain sections of this legislation. So again, keep that in mind. Policy does change over time depending on who's in power and the public sentiment. All right, that concludes our policy unit. Thank you.